Here we have a Villiers engine as found in Penguin and Beaver Amphibious ATVs. It's a 197cc single cylinder. It has electric start, which is reversible. It has a 4-speed transmission, and it has fan cooling. I'm just going to take a quick run through a few things on the outside of this engine. I'm not going to tear this engine apart. This is an engine I don't believe has ever been installed on a machine. It was received complete as we see it here, except for the display stand I've made for it. It's on a motor mount, which is the same as what it was used in the Beaver and Penguin. I'm not sure if that's how it was shipped from Villiers, but anyway, we'll take a quick look at this engine and I'll point out a few things. Now, for anyone that has to do any service or repairs on one of these engines in a Beaver or Penguin ATV, I recommend a few things. First of all, I recommend a few manuals. Here we have a Penguin illustrated parts list. This has any exploded diagrams of the engine, transmission, electric starter generator, as well as the machine itself. So if you need to do any disassembly, you can see where the nuts and bolts and screws are, so you don't get into too much trouble. A copy of this manual can be seen online. I will provide a link in the description of the video. We also have a copy of a couple of pages out of an Intertech snowmobile manual, which actually covers the Beaver service, how to adjust the chains, how to overhaul the engine and transmission. There's also a section on the Villiers engine and transmission in the manual that these pages come out of. I didn't copy them here because I have actual Villiers documents. But anyway, this manual gives some tips as to adjustments to make on the machine. We also have a Dynastart operating instruction and parts list. And we have a Villiers maintenance manual, which covers the engine, transmission, and Dynastart. And we have a Villiers parts list. So if you need to get any replacement parts for the engine, transmission in the Penguin and Beaver, the parts numbers listed in this manual should actually coincide with the parts numbers listed in the Penguin parts list. And the Penguin parts list pretty much covers the Beaver except for things like rear handles on the machine and the steering. Now, of course, a lot of those parts are not available, but it shows you how a lot of the stuff goes together anyway, so if you have to get into tearing anything apart, you can see what to expect when you get into it. Now, besides having some manuals to show you how stuff goes together or comes apart, here are some tools that are handy to have. Here we have an exhaust spanner. It's a pin spanner for removing the exhaust nut, which is a fin nut on the Villiers engine. We also have a rotor tool for removing the SEBA Dynastart rotor. This is a tool for holding the center of the clutch hub. When you remove the center nut on it, it's handy to be able to hold it. Here's a tool that I made. It's a spark plug with a bolt through it, used for finding top dead center so we can set the ignition timing. And here we have some British standard wrenches. Now, the fasteners on the Villiers engine found in the Penguin and Beaver are not metric or standard, they're British standard. So the thread pitches are different and the head sizes on some of the fasteners are different. Now, you may be able to find something in your toolbox if you have a mixture of SAE or inch tools and metric tools that will fit the fasteners that are on the engine. And I'll just show you a little bit about the British standard wrenches. If you can see that this wrench, for example, if the camera will focus, is marked 5/16 wrench, is marked 5/16 BSW. And we put it on the ruler, that measures 5/8. Here we have a 7/16 British Standard wrench, and that's, what is that? That's closer to 7/8. Anyway, we can see that the British Standard wrenches aren't the same as metric or SAE or inch wrenches, and that's the sizes that are on the Villiers engine that we will be looking at today. Okay, so back to the engine. So the engine itself has a Villiers carb on it. It says made in England on here. On the other side, it would say it does say Villiers, pardon me. And the model of the carburetor is an S25-3, which we can't see because my camera's not going to focus, but it says S25-3. So the controls here are the throttle is on this cable here. The choke is on this cable here. We have a pilot adjustment on the carburetor, which is used to adjust the low-speed mixture. And we have here a tickler button. Now, besides the cable-operated choke, when you go to start this engine cold, if it's a little reluctant to start, what you can do is push the tickler button and hold it down for a second. And what that does is it pushes the float down into the fuel in the carburetor and allows the fuel to overflow into the throat of the carburetor so that you can prime the engine to start. Now we have an air filter on here. Let's grab the spark plug. Here we have the right hand side cover with the Villiers name on it. Now underneath this small cover are two sets of points, and you may wonder, why do we have two sets of points when we have a single cylinder engine? Well, the electric starter generator, which is also underneath this cover, is reversible. So this engine runs forward and reverse, and it needs both sets of points, one for forward direction and one for reverse. Now the wires seen here are the wires to the points. They connect to the wires over here when they're installed in the machine. Now here we have a gear shift, which would normally be pretty much straight down in the machine. And here we have a wire leading out of the side cover, which connects to this connector for a neutral indicator light. And while we're on this connector, anybody who owns a Penguin and Beaver, if you get into the wiring, you may notice in this connector, again, if the camera will focus, we have brown to brown, black to black, yellow to gray, and red to red. We have white to, that's where the neutral indicator wire goes. Then we have blue to blue. So if you pull this connector out, notice that some of the wires don't match one side to the other. That's not necessarily a mistake. So this is the connector in the Penguin and Beaver that would be found if you're sitting in the driver's seat. It would be under the side of the body, pretty much at your elbow. And while we're on this side of the engine, I'll show you that there is a drain plug hidden under here for draining the transmission. The transmission takes SAE 30 oil, just a regular 30 weight oil. It actually says here to use Castrol LX SAE 30, and this plug is where you would add the oil, and there's also a dipstick on it. And on this side here, we have a plug to fill the primary chain case. The engine is of course here, and the transmission is the rear half of the engine. You can just barely see the sprocket here. So directly underneath this plug is the clutch. Now it says here to use SAE 20. I just normally use SAE 30, the same as in the transmission. And the amount of oil you put in here, what you do is you take this plug out. This is the drain, sorry, not the drain, the level indicator plug. You add oil to the primary chain case until oil starts to dribble out here, and then you put the plug back in. There are drain plugs for the primary chain case if you're going to change the oil. We can just barely see it there. There's a plug here, and there's also a plug further up. We can't see very well, but it is there. While we're on the subject of plugs, there's also a plug here in the crankcase, and that is for draining the crankcase if you happen to flood the engine over very badly and it won't start. Now, while we're on the front of the engine, we can see, now this is the motor mount here. This would normally be bolted to the floor of the Penguin or Beaver with a series of bolts. It'd be difficult to get at those bolts, but the good news is to take the engine out we don't have to, because the axle would go through one of these holes and there are a couple of support rods that would go through these other holes, making it impossible or very difficult to take this mount out with the engine. If we remove this bolt, and there's a nut here, and take, let's see if we can see it down here, there's a stud here with a nut on this end and a nut on this end, and it actually should have a screw slot there. So you take both nuts off. If we look, there just happens to be a hole right here that corresponds with that mounting stud, and you can just slide the stud right out through here. Now we can see the clutch lever here, which would normally have a clutch cable hooked into the end of it. And just a note here, when this is installed in the machine, there should be a little bit of play in that, just so we know the clutch is fully engaged. So you can hear that I just barely move it. There might be a 1/16 of an inch there. So anyway, when that's in the machine, we want some play in that. Okay, what else? Well, over here, this is the attachment for the jack shaft that would be in the Penguin and Beaver to transfer the power from the output sprocket, to the jack shaft, and the jack shaft would be here. What else is there on here? Well, there's another drain plug here, which I don't think we need to get into. It might be a level plug. I've never confirmed that. But I think if we took the dipstick out of the top and measured it down, that might be the oil level in the transmission. Now, this engine came complete with ignition switch, the neutral indicator light, the generator light, there's the ignition switch, and the black box. Now I have the black box cover loose here. We can see the name on it, SEBA. So SEBA produced the starter generator, or Dynastart as it's called. I'll just set this out of the way. And the control box looks like this. In here we have the ignition coil. This engine uses a battery type ignition. It does not have a magneto in it. So here's the ignition coil, looks like a small car coil. Here's the condenser that works with the points to produce the spark. This is the, let's see, it's got a lot packed into it. It's the starter solenoid. It's also the voltage regulator and generator cutout. Now here we have the reversing solenoid with all its wires here. So what happens when you put the key in the reverse position, which in this ignition switch is to the left, this solenoid reverses the polarity of the starter, so the engine cranks backwards. It also switches the coil to get to go through the set of points timed for reverse engine rotation, and it also receives the power from the generator in reverse polarity, so it charges the battery. So hopefully we don't get to see the inside of this much. The good news is, of course, none of this is what would be called solid state. There's no transistors, there's computers in this engine. This is all electrical mechanical stuff. If this engine doesn't want to crank over forward, or there's no spark, what you can do is, well, for one thing, it's got points, non-electronic ignition, so you can clean the points, adjust them, make sure they're making contact. The cover can be taken off of this solenoid if need be to make sure everything's making contact, and the same with the voltage regulator. Now, while we're here, all these wires, some of which are all black and the same size, these wires are actually all marked. If you have to disconnect the engine from the black box, and that's probably the easiest way to remove the engine from the machine, is to disconnect it here. Once you get the cover off of here, which is a little bit of a squeeze while it's in the machine, you simply take all the nuts off and all the lock washers and flat washers, and it's hard to see here in this light, but every terminal is marked on this board, and actually every connector on here, every terminal, like the end of the wire, is stamped with a corresponding mark, so that this is marked D plus B2, so this lug would actually be marked that. And also this grommet here, now I wouldn't I'd actually pull this battery cable out of this grommet if I was disconnecting the black box, so that I don't have to take this battery cable off the starter solenoid. But anyway, if you pull that out of there, that wire out of there, and there's a split there to allow you to do it, and take all those wires off, the grommet holds everything in position. So you don't really have to guess where everything goes, because it's held in position, and then if you check the marking on the terminals, you can see where they go. Anyway, I've seen those wires cut. I guess some people look at them and say they're all black, and they're all the same size, so it mustn't matter which goes where, so I'll just cut them. Please don't do that. It's very difficult to figure out which belongs where when you put it all back together. Anyway, let's see. This is the fan screen. There's a fan behind here, which blows air, of course, across the cylinder and cylinder head to cool the engine. This should be kept clean, and this should be kept installed as well to keep dirt out of the engine. And unfortunately, some of the early Penguins, the duct under the driver's seat did not have a screen in it, so it was easy for leaves, etc., to get drawn in and plug this screen and starve the engine of cooling air. Now, something else while we're here, this cooling shroud is a little bit in the way if you want to do anything with this carburetor while the engine's in the machine. The bolts for the carburetor are hidden back in here, and now there is a clamp which we can't see, it's just ahead of my finger there, which would allow the carburetor to slide off the intake manifold, except that the float bowl sits in a depression in the engine to help keep the engine low. They've put the carburetor down into a little depression in the engine because of the intake port position, which affects intake timing, etc. The carburetor sits low, so it has to come off with the intake manifold. So you have to take this shroud off, and it's held by one bolt, and hopefully your engine does not have these screws in it, because this is normally against the duct with the black box sitting right against it. So these screws, this one you might be able to get a screwdriver on, but this one is very difficult to get at. Now, you may be able to move the black box out of the way to get that screw out, but personally, if I have this fan cover off and I need to take those screws out, I do not replace them. Now, that makes the engine not exactly original, I guess, but the fan shroud stays on and doesn't noticeably rattle or anything, so I leave those screws out, because I like to take that off if I have to do it with the carburetor, which is every spring and fall, basically. Anyway, we also have a couple of screws here, one at the back where you can see it, and there's another one right here above the exhaust, which may or may not be in your shroud. But if you're taking the shroud off, you have to take this nut off and the washer, take this screw out, then this half of the shroud will stay in until you get this half of the shroud out, it lifts off and you can wiggle it out of the engine compartment, and then this half you can lift it up and turn it and pull it out so that you can get at the carburetor screws. Okay, now I don't see anything else on here other than, of course, on this plate we have the engine, Type 9L, and the serial number, and it was made in Wolverhampton, England by Villiers. We also have a plate on this side which tells you how to mix your fuel for engine lubrication. I personally use a approximately 20-to-1 mixture of high test gasoline with hopefully no ethanol in it, and a synthetic two-stroke oil. Okay, so there we have, with a lot of ums and pauses, brief description and look at the 97cc 9 3/4 horsepower Villiers two-stroke engine used in the Penguin and Beaver ATV.